Thank you, Bruce. Shall we dance? And that is the question that we must answer, and it's the question that those early disciples of Jesus had to answer for themselves as they experienced the complete collapse of what they had experienced so far and what they thought was going to be. I love this Sunday after Easter Sunday, and I love the scripture passage from the Gospel of John that Jenny read for us. And it shows up every single year in the 3-year lectionary cycle. So I've preached on it many times. And as I've preached on it in the past, back when I used to be much more of an expert than I am now, I would be critical of these disciples that were locked away in the upper room. However, as I have lived more of life and experienced my own grief and sat with the grief in the trauma of others, I find that I become much and much less of an expert in how people, quote, should experience their grief and their trauma and the great changes of life. And I think there's a lot that we can draw from this passage, from this story, from this experience that the disciples had with the risen Christ. So 3 movements that I would like to talk about briefly this morning in this passage. In the first movement, which I usually completely ignore or criticize, is the upper room itself. The disciples were frightened. Whether their fear was rightly directed, as the gospel seems to portray, to the religious entity of the time, the Jews, or might have been better directed at the Roman Empire that actually had executed Jesus, I don't know. But they had every reason to be afraid. They were grieving. They were sad that this one that was their teacher had died, had been captured and executed. Just when they were on the cusp of just starting to get what all of this might be about in the 3 short years they were with him, he is taken from them. And I imagine they were worried and anxious about their future. They discovered this movement, they discovered this teacher, and most of them left everything to be involved with it and to follow. And it looked like it was coming crashing down. So they retreated to this upper room. It's easy to imagine that this upper room was the same room that they had gathered in days earlier as they shared that last meal with Jesus. Maybe it was already rented for the week or the month, and so they just returned back to that space. And the memories that space held, the better memories of a meal shared with friends and a teacher professing his love for them and showing his love for them by the washing of their feet. It was a space that brought comfort and maybe a little bit of security. So they went back to what was familiar. They went back to being together, at least most of them. I think when we are grieving, when we experience trauma, whatever our upper room is, at least in part, and for most of us, not totally and not all of the time, but it seems like the best way to begin to work through that and to move through that is to be able to be with people that we know and people that we trust. It's one of the things that's made the past year so difficult for so many of us is that our upper room spaces have been shut down. I know there are many of us that are sorely missing being physically present together as a faith community and being on the campus that holds so many precious memories for so many of us, ranging from months to years to decades for some of us. And we look back to being gathered together again, just to be in the proximity of people. And we've done a fantastic job as a church, as a society, and with our friends of figuring out ways of being together and sustaining that community. But it's just not the same for most of us as being physically present with one another. We need those upper room places. For many of us, it's out in nature, getting our feet in the sand and smelling the salt air. For many of us, we have places in our home. I love my desk that serves as kind of a desk and an altar and just a space for me where I'm surrounded by my books of people that are some long gone that serve as a faith community for me and ritual objects and totems and talismans that remind me of my spiritual place in my spiritual journey. Now, there are more helpful and healthy ways of dealing with our grief and our sadness and our fear and our trauma and in better ways. And I think what's important for all of us, instead of being so quick to push off the upper room, is to really give it some thought. When we get to those places in our lives, not if we get to those places, but when we get to those places, where is it that we go? It's good to think about that beforehand, because when we're in the midst of it, it's sometimes really difficult to remember and to find. And grief and trauma doesn't have to be just something big, like the loss of a parent or a spouse or a job or our own safety and security. For some of us, and honestly, for most of us, most of the time that are here together this morning, those griefs and traumas are smaller. It sometimes involves just not being where we want to be. I was reminded by that just about what I was feeling and experiencing some over this past week, and that were echoed by the words of Paul Tillich, a theologian. He says, by autobiographically, year after year, and thinking about Easter, the longed for perfection of life does not appear. When the old compulsions reign within us, as they have for decades, when despair destroys all joy and courage. You ever experienced that? I just had quite a week this week. There's Easter Sunday, which takes a little bit of extra energy and effort that really isn't recognized by the rest of the world. So Monday morning, I go back to my day job, and everything is as it was before, and there's as much work to be done this week as there was last week. And so I make it through the week. I'm driving home Friday night, and turns out that the person that was supposed to work the on-call shift Friday night wasn't there. And so we have procedures and policies in place to catch that before the last minute. And I know that none of you that work in organizations will recognize this, but those policies and procedures weren't followed. And I get a call at 5:15 Friday night that we don't have an on-call staff person for our social workers and chaplains on Friday night. So at the end of an exhausting week, I found myself being on call Friday night. And then after that, we get up on Saturday morning, and it turns out that Emerson has a pretty big project that's due on Monday that we have not made much progress toward yet. So much of our Saturday was involved with that. And I tell you that not to solicit sympathy or advice. And bless your hearts, I know that most of y'all are chomping at the bit to offer both. But just to recognize that this is part of life. It is when, not if, we just get laid back on our backs and need to find that place that is our upper room, that we can find some rest and some solace, and when it's appropriate, community. And so that's where the disciples were. They were locked in. They had found this place. And here's where the story gets even better. In the midst of all that, in the midst of the fear and the grief and the trauma and the locked door, the divine presence of the risen Christ makes his way in. They didn't know which way to turn. But in the midst of that confusion, the risen Christ is there. And so what does Jesus do? Look at this passage. Does he chastise them? Does he say, come on, guys, I spent 3 years with you teaching you what to do. Why are you locked in a room? No. He doesn't criticize them. He doesn't even offer advice at first. He says, my peace I give to you. And then what does he do? He breathes on them. And I know we get a little anxious when we hear that now. It's like, Jesus, no, we don't do that anymore. But he did. He breathed on them. He imparted his spirit, and he sent them out. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then what happens? The disciples are raring to go then, right? So they leave that locked room and move out into society, in community, and proclaim and live the gospel because of the pep talk they received from Jesus, right? They don't. And we didn't read the whole passage, but what follows what we just read, what Jenny just read, was A week later, Jesus came back because Thomas, one of the disciples, wasn't with the disciples when Jesus came, and he didn't believe the disciples. He needed a little of extra encouragement. So Jesus comes back. And where are all the disciples a week later? They're still in the room with a closed door. And Jesus comes in again. And again, he's not hollering at them. He's not pointing out their shortcomings. He's coming to pick up the one that needed a little extra help, Thomas, and said, Thomas, here I am. In the midst of our upper room experiences, the presence of the divine is available to us. In fact, sometimes it's only in those upper room experiences where we don't know which way else to turn that we're open to that presence, that direct presence of Jesus. Jesus didn't come in and tell them what they were supposed to believe or explain to them the theology of the resurrection. No, he just said, here I am, my peace is with you. And I think that's the opportunity we have in the practice of our faith and the practice of our spirituality, which we just never really seem to completely catch on to. We talk about our faith and argue about our faith and debate our faith instead of giving ourselves to the mystical. And I know that's a scary word for some of us, but all mysticism is a direct experience of the divine, an unmediated experience of the divine. You don't need a pastor. You don't need an institution. We need an openness to the presence of God and how God wants to move in our lives and bring peace in the midst of anxiety, to bring joy in the midst of grief and sorrow, to bring purpose in the midst of our malaise. So the presence of the divine is available to us. And then what does the risen Christ do? After imparting the Spirit, the same Spirit that was available to him from God, available to us now as well. He says, go. As the Father sends me, so send I you. The upper room is a necessary place to be. Over and over again, usually in the normal life. But the upper room is not a place to stay. In the midst of our grief, in the midst of our fear and anxiety, we are sent out. Not waiting until we have all of our stuff together, not waiting till we have it all figured out, but in the presence of the divine in whom we live and move and have our being, we move out. You see, our spiritual journey isn't just to deal with our own stuff, but in the midst of dealing with our stuff, being that light to the world. And Jesus offers these words. We didn't read them this morning, but the passage goes on to say that I'm sending you. If you forgive the sins of anyone, they're forgiven. If you retain the sins of anyone, they are retained. And I don't actually know all of what that means. Maybe I should, but I don't. But I do have this sense that this just isn't a private endeavor behind closed doors in peace. It's moving out where we are engaged and involved with the very communal sin of the world. This all comes back to relationship with one another, with the incredible privilege and the responsibility of living in forgiveness, not holding on to the wrongs that are done to us and the wrongs that are done to the world, but offering forgiveness, letting people know that forgiveness is available, that we don't have to live in guilt and shame, and yet retaining sins as well. And somehow, in some way, looking at the great societal sins of the world, the injustices that are perpetrated, the bigotry that's lived, and saying, this is not okay. And constantly, continuously, in love, bringing it to the attention of the world. Difficult endeavors, tough business, which quite often is going to produce additional fear and anxiety and hurts. And so what do? We go back to the upper room. We encourage one another. We engage in those activities that bring us peace and joy and solace. We meet the presence of the divine. We remind ourselves that we're loved. And we are inspirited and we're sent out again. It's a cycle. It's a process. One of my favorite quotes on grief, and as you can imagine, I've collected many over the years, is by Anne Lamott. And I love this invitation that she has. You will lose someone that you can't live without. And your heart will be badly broken. And the bad news is that you never completely get over the loss of your beloved. But this is also the good news. They live forever in your broken heart that doesn't seal back up. And you come through. It's like having a broken leg that never heals perfectly, that still hurts when the weather gets cold. But you learn to dance with the limp. Our opportunity, our privilege, and yes, our responsibility is people of faith and community, is to continue to learn to dance with the limp.